Thanks everyone for joining for our session on bank de-risking partnerships for prosperity. How can private sector partnerships work hand in hand with NGOs to reach the most vulnerable populations? We've got a great panel here today. Thanks to our speakers, Mark Tate. He's the NGO Senior Consultant of Western Union Business Solutions. Then we have Sandra Kraneman. She's the Thematic Legal Advisor for Geneva Call. And we've got Virginie Lefebvre, Program and Partnerships Coordinator of Amel Association International of Lebanon. And just to, I think, give a little bit of a setting the scene on why we thought that this session was important to share is because basically we've had many of our NGO members who've in the past years and more increasingly been impacted by bank de-risking issues, by legal and restrictions placed by governments, by counterterrorism measures to operate and to have transactions be shared among others to be carried out in the humanitarian sector, especially right now in a current situation of the counterterrorism aspects. And as a result, we've been working together with other actors to ensure that we can advocate, we can work collectively to look at forward thinking, look at solutions, or at least to look at other aspects of how can we create meaningful partnerships to reach the most vulnerable populations of the NGOs. So without further ado, I would actually like to start with Mark and to share some of his experiences as the NGO Senior Consultant at Western Union Business Solutions, to share some of their perspectives on how they've been working together with NGOs to support this issue that we're facing as NGOs, especially in the humanitarian sector. Mark, you're on mute, I think.
We go. Can you hear me?
Perfect, yes.
Lovely. Thanks, Nishan, ICVA, for inviting me to this event. It's a great initiative and very much one that I happen to be involved in on a bit of a global level. So just a bit of a brief introduction. I've worked with Western Union Business Solutions for about 10 years now. And predominantly during that time, I've worked with some of the more large INGO actors in the sector, Oxfam, SAVE, IRW, to mention a few. And during the course of that time, I've supported most of the humanitarian disasters, natural disasters, and other events that have caused, quite a lot of pain within the sector. And as you mentioned, the de-risking aspect, which came about after 2008 and the banking collapse. Obviously, there was a lot of banks who were penalised, rightly so, for doing things incorrectly, and that is an ongoing thing. So I don't know if I can just very quickly share a slide on here, just to illustrate. No, that doesn't look as though that's going to work, so I shall just move swiftly on. Okay, so basically have supported the Syrian crisis when it first came about, and basically partnered or supported Save the Children and Oxfam in particular in alleviating the situation around Syria and the migration of their populace. Obviously a very trying time. Lots of people, having to leave the area very quickly, and so our clients are, wanting to support in the region, but have to be compliant with anti-terrorist funding, AML, and many other global regulations and laws. We, as a business, do navigate that consistently, that entire compliance environment in terms of delivering funds in a safe and transparent fashion, and have supported Syria, the Ebola crisis, the annexation of Crimea, Gorka in Nepal, and Typhoon Haiyan, to name a few events. This section is around partnering post de-risking. I would position it actually as more of a relationship build. Building a relationship with a credible banking or money service provider, a partner, is how an NGO is going to help themselves first and foremost. Having a level of sophistication or understanding of, say, a trustee's obligations, how you perform due diligence on partners or indeed staff, having to be aware of HMRC, OFSI, OFAC rules and regulations. NGOs, even today, still struggle with those challenges of being able to navigate the language, let alone the intent of a lot of these laws or regulations. And so finding a credible partner in whichever country you are based in, I would say is probably the first and foremost thing that you can do to further the organisation's credibility, let alone ability to deliver into the field. And this can be on an ongoing programme basis. This can be in answer to natural disasters, humanitarian aid crises. And so, yeah, being able to partner with someone that actually hasn't de-risked, I know is probably a bit of an ask in this day and age. But actually there are some key actors in the banking sector, like ourselves, like Barclays and a few others, who actually do dedicate themselves to the NGO sector. And from our perspective, I mean, as I say, I've been doing this about 10 years now. We have a global team, and indeed, even our CEO, Hikmet Ersek, is dedicated to the NGO sector, and made that very clear back in 2012 when we actually developed our cash delivery tool, which has been invaluable, as you can imagine, in delivering aid when the banking sector not only is de-risking, but also is kind of fractured, because I think a lot of charities, NGOs, don't understand the banking sector and how we actually move money on our clients' behalf. There's a lot of moving components to that. And so, you know, having a robust, credible banking partner provider, again, is going to help you have that robustness and an ability to please donors. You know, knowing that Western Union are your provider, usually kind of raises an eyebrow maybe to start with, because we're only typically known for being on, you know, street corners, in kiosks, etc., etc. But actually, Western Union Business Solutions is the corporate arm of the business, and we utilise all the tools that Western Union as a whole can bring to bear to, as our tagline is, move money for better. That is our mantra. That is what we abide by. And as an ongoing concern, and I'm kind of conscious of time, I've got 5-7 minutes and then Q&A after that, if that's okay. We consistently look to partner with NGOs and indeed member organisations with a view to education, primarily, to deliver value, whether that's a monetary value or not. And we do that through collaboration, you know, and so we will happily host sessions or work with the likes of Bond or Jocus in Ireland, and the various bodies around the world that represent NGOs within their home countries. Further to that, I'm also privileged to be on a very large panel called the Tri-Sector Working Group in the UK. This panel is comprised, as you can imagine, of 3 parts. That is banking. So I can mention a couple of names here. So ourselves and Barclays and a couple of other providers. Then that you have the charities being represented, again, by some of the key players on a global footprint. Oxfam, Save Children, IRW, CAF Bank, and Bond as the membership body are also represented. And then more importantly, we also are privileged to have HMRC, FCA, OFSI, Foreign Office, Home Office, and the FCDO, as it's now known, DFID as was, are all sat at the table. And the aim of this group, and we've been talking now for the best part of 2.5, 3 years, is to address, I think, the kind of title of this session. How do you operate safely, securely, delivering, whether it's institutional funding or public funding, in a safe and transparent manner, whilst adhering to the enhanced levels and increasingly enhanced levels of compliance and enhanced due diligence, especially when you're operating in more sensitive regions of the world. This is actually a very hot topic. I was actually on a call yesterday. I can't disclose anything, unfortunately, from that particular session. We also have some of the main legal advice to the government as well sat at the table, which is incredibly helpful in terms of interpretation. So I mentioned, I think, at the top of this session about language. There's a lot of language that the banking sector may use, which NGOs may not be aware of. And when you have that disconnect, all of a sudden, you don't have the layers and depth of transparency or breadth of transparency that is required for us to operate on an NGO's behalf. So yeah, this group is basically tasked, well, we've tasked ourselves with operating on a global footprint in a safe and transparent manner, but in answer to all of the expectations and obligations that we as a provider and an NGO as an actor have within the sector. And it is coming along really nicely, I believe. We've actually got some deliverables that we can bring to the table in the new year, in terms of, sort of answering some of the core objectives of the group. And over time, and this isn't going to be any kind of quick answer, as you can imagine, when you get government involved, but we have at least their ear. And it means that if the UK government is going to provide a key NGO with £10 million of funding, when they're trying to push those payments through, whether it's to ultimate beneficiaries, so local individuals, staff members, programme officers, etc., those funds won't be stopped. There won't be deductions. There won't be all the kind of complications that I think a lot of NGOs still suffer from if you're not using a robust partner. So yeah, there's a lot of partnering, as we title it, but actually it's more about building relationships and building an understanding. So in conclusion, I hope that kind of indicates a more positive message, maybe, from the banking sector, that actually there are players in the field who are more than happy to support NGOs. But it is first and foremost about building a relationship, building a common language, and building an understanding about what our NGO clients are doing or wanting to achieve. And from there, we can actually support through many other various tools, whether it be products, services, or just advice. We have been there and we have done that. So I would welcome all to engage, with us, or indeed with your banking partner as it stands right now, and try and further that relationship.
Thanks so much for that, Mark. I think this is Jeremy Rempel here, the moderator for the session that was not on at the beginning. So hopefully, hello. I'm here now, and hopefully I'm coming through okay. It sounds like you can hear me. But thanks for that initial words there, Mark. And please, Nishani is reminded in the chat, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those in there, and we'll moderate those through as well to each of the speakers. Maybe a couple of initial points that we can follow up on. So one, when it comes to this concept of broader partnership with the banking industry, with NGOs, engaging with government on advocacy, maybe how would you describe the collective win-win, I guess? So what's the kind of collective, I guess, win that we get out of it on all sides? So advocacy is a collective approach, and then how can we frame that better as something that all of us are benefiting from? Over to you.
I think initially, I suppose there's two prongs to that, and the first one definitely comes back to all of the elements that I just described. Language is, the food of love, or whatever that phrase is. And in my experience, in the last 5 years in particular, by forging relationships and commonalities with, in particular, the regulators. So I also dialogue with the Charity Commission in the UK on a fairly regular basis, the membership bodies as well. We, as a banking partner, then can advocate within our own business, and that has been something I've had to do to educate my wider business on the needs of the NGO sector, and therefore, making sure that we're equipped appropriately to do so. But then through collaboration, you then have a louder voice. And I know this sounds very, simplistic in approach, but it's played out, especially in the last 3 years, I would say, where I'll be talking to one of my clients who have come up against a particular problem, issue, query even, on how to navigate a new regulatory requirement. Once we build a commonality and a trust, and I think that is one of the key things that government are definitely looking for from the sector, whether it's us in the banking sector or the NGO sector. Once you have the language, then you can build the trust. And that's where the true advocacy comes from. And that is why the Tri-Sector Group was congratulated yesterday by Jonathan Hall QC for its approach to the ongoing objectives and how we've consistently come to the table. We're all there with a common goal. Whether that is driven, I don't think typically it's driven from a corporate social responsibility charter within the key players in the sector. I think it comes down to individuals quite often, and a driven and focused direction. So yeah, it's two-pronged, but they're very much wrapped up and entwined within each other, I would say.
Yeah, thanks. I think certainly those concepts of how we build trust, and then also the need for improved collective action that you've been discussing in your tripartite group, for example, quite important. Both of those themes resonate pretty well across a number of the risk areas that we've been engaged in, and particularly in this area, I think the critical challenge of getting people to break out and actually have more public discourse on some of the challenges, and not keep it too closed down just because it is a sensitive topic.
Yeah, you've actually hit on one of the key linchpins, I would say, actually, of the common dialogue that we're having at the moment. So to my clients, I would always advocate that even when something affects your organization that becomes public discourse and obviously a reputational risk, first and foremost, you speak to your banking partner, because they're the ones that are ultimately carrying the risks, that we're the ones that will ultimately get the larger fines compared to an NGO. So being upfront, being incredibly transparent, even though it's like being a scolded child or knowing that you've got a bad school report. You don't just wait at the top of the stairs waiting for your parents to get home. You go to the bottom of the stairs and you go, look, yeah, okay, I could have done better. So that is first point, is the transparency. But sharing risk is very much a hot topic at the moment. Once all parties within that conversation have accepted their portion of risk, you can move that conversation on very quickly. And again, there's something I wish I could disclose at this time, but we've managed to achieve something in the last week that has been 3 years in the making. We never considered it was even possible because of the amount of regulation and oversight that we have to be beholden to. But by sharing risk across the NGOs, the banking partners, and also in concert with the local regulators, all of a sudden doors open very quickly.
Thanks for that, Mark. I think it will be interesting to touch on a couple of these topics as we hear from the other speakers too. Certainly, I think this point around sharing risk quite interesting, as well as trust and collective action too. Maybe one additional question. So this has certainly become an increasing focus as part of the COVID-19 response, and on the humanitarian side, the intent to rely increasingly on local and national partners in response. And I wonder if you had any comments from your perspective on how we deal with that challenge. So how do we improve access to funding for these smaller partners that frequently do not have the global presence or internal departments able to focus on some of these issues like bank de-risking? So how do we ensure appropriate access to funds and transfer of funds for those smaller partners?
That's a really good point. I just noticed in the chat section, someone's asked as well about, does it only apply to large INGOs? No, indeed, it doesn't. We actually serve a very broad cross-section of SME all the way to corporate, as we would class them, in size and capability. Indeed, we have a lovely little charity that just tend to abandoned dogs in Tunisia, I think. Just two ladies funding, the entire charitable cause themselves out of their own salaries. And they came to us because banks weren't prepared to entertain them because maybe they're not commercially viable enough. Again, Western Union, we're very uniquely positioned that we can leverage the broader business to support the sector. And I think that might be applicable to a few of the other key banking entities in the globe. But in terms of accessing funds, again, this comes down to language. Accessing funds is, from my perspective, it would be from a fundraising perspective. But what you're talking about is deliverability into the field, whatever that cause might look like. And again, I suppose Western Union are very privileged to be able to leverage our agent network. So top line things, we've delivered 10 billion in the last 10 years in humanitarian aid and funds. And that's via bank-to-bank, cash and mobile. So not all banking providers have that capability, and cash in particular, when I talked about the crises that we've supported before, so Gorka, Haiyan, Syria, etc. The predominant support that we were giving to our clients was via cash because the banking structure had collapsed. Intermediary banks, correspondent banks were dropping up in and out. It becomes very unstable. You get charges, delays, multiple layers of queries because they want to make sure that they're transacting in a safe and transparent manner. So to answer in brief, it's not just for the larger ones. All charities, if they are prepared, again, to have that dialogue and put the time and resource into working with their business partners, then they can operate on an international level. I would suggest that if they're not prepared to do that, they shouldn't even be considering working on an international level in the first place, because you are just going to make a world of pain for yourself.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective, Mark. I know certainly I didn't share at the beginning, some of these discussion points link well into our broader series on risk management and organizational culture that we've been doing throughout the year, in addition to the bank de-risking topic. So I think some interesting follow-up points, perhaps especially for our local and national partners as we consider how to improve risk management in practice. Right, I saw a little glitch there. Hopefully I'm still coming through okay.
Yeah, my battery actually just came out. But on that note, as I explained to Nishani, I do have to leave now. Nishani, I see a few people are wanting to reach out. If you could follow.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mark, for your comments. And as you said, we'll look forward to continuing the conversation. And I look forward myself as well to engaging more, especially hearing about the actions that will take place this next year with some of the tripartite work. So I think more to come in the year ahead, but thanks for your comments today. Excellent. Right, friends, so we'll keep moving through. I know we're moving quickly through our hour here, and I want to introduce our next speaker for the day, which will be Dr. Sandra Kroneman, who's a thematic legal advisor with the Geneva Call. So welcome, Sandra. Sandra is working on conducting legal research on impacts of counterterrorism, human rights law, international humanitarian law, so a good intersection of a number of topics, I think, linked into our discussion today. She also worked previously as a senior research fellow at Geneva Academy for Swiss Ministry of Defense as a consultant for NGOs, and in the University of Geneva system as well. So I think an interesting mix of backgrounds that will hopefully lead to some interesting conversation today as well. So Sandra, over to you for your comments this morning.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. And I just realized I just sent you my academic bibliography. So, but I think as Jeremy just explained, in a way, I have like a dual hat. You know, on the one hand, I have a very academic background where I did a lot of research on counterterrorism and how it interacts with human rights law and IHL in general. And then today I call this my hobby. And then in my real life, I work for Geneva Call, which if some of you may know, is a humanitarian organization, and we work exclusively in armed conflict areas with actors with a view to improve the protection of the civilian population. So in many respects, you know, counterterrorism laws and measures in general, and then bank de-risking affects us very directly because it's the heart of our operations. I mean, it's a pity that now Mark has left, because I think I'm probably embodying what he just said about NGOs, that quite often many NGOs do have a thematic, or they have like a counterterrorism person who will look into counterterrorism laws and policies and measures, how they affect our operations across the board. I think what Mark also mentioned is it's difficult for us to navigate this because of the way how these have multiplied years, and because every country has different ones, and as we operate across the globe, many different frameworks apply to us. And then you have an overlapping of criminal law frameworks, sanction frameworks. So especially for small or medium-sized NGOs, I think it's very challenging to navigate it, and we don't always understand the language. And then on top of that is true, and it's certainly true for myself, we don't quite understand how the banking sector works. We just know it's difficult for us to transfer money into certain jurisdictions. So as many of the CT advisors, then what I do is we work on mitigating risk, we run on the CT laws and measures, and then quite often, admittedly, on the back burner is actually how can we better work together with banks. Because on the one hand, we have from a CT law, we have an organizational risk, you know, reputational risk, and as Mark said, we could get fines. But I think another element is also our employees have an individual risk, and they face an individual risk of criminal liability, and that's particularly acute also for local employees, so not expats, which I think is an important layer that admittedly has nothing to do with bank de-risking, but we often spend more time on how to manage that risk because it directly affects our staff and it's part of our duty of care as well. But then also linked to that, you know, we also have risks actually when we are unable to transfer money, or when money is getting blocked and then money arrives late, and then you have to, you can't do your current payment. That becomes very quickly a very risky situations. Or it also just risky if people in some contexts, if they have to go to the bank to check every day where the money has arrived, and going to the bank is just inherently risky. So I do think there are also, yes, some risks are shared, but I also think some risks are particular to not only the NGOs, but also individuals of the NGOs who have to assume that risk. So what I wanted to speak a little bit more about is advocacy, because, you know, now we speak about the fact that, or what Mark explained, there's a regulatory framework, and then we need to figure out how to operate in that regulatory framework. While ideally, as you could also avoid having a framework that provides for further restrictions. Because once you have the restrictions, you know, you need to kind of try to open up the restrictions while you could try to do it beforehand. And that's precisely what we did with Geneva Call, and actually also with the help of ICVA this year in Switzerland. Just very briefly, Switzerland never had comprehensive counterterrorism legislation before. And then in summer and autumn of this year, there was a bill pending in Parliament providing for new criminal law offenses, including a provision that would have prohibited support to terrorist groups. So very similar to the US one, which then, of course, I would assume would also have had repercussions for how the banks operate, because they probably understandably would have wanted to make sure that they're not working together with NGOs that could be captured up in this. So what we then did is that we advocated with Parliament to add a humanitarian exemption to this clause. And I'm very happy to say in the end we were successful, because now there is an exemption where it says that this does not apply to humanitarian activities by impartial humanitarian actors. When discussing with Nishani a bit this session, we were just brainstorming a bit how a partnership could actually have helped, also in that kind of advocacy, so at the level before it becomes the framework. And one of the things we came up with is when we were talking to people and explaining, why we needed this exemption, we realized it's not just us who don't understand necessarily how the banking works, but it was also a lot of the MPs that didn't quite understand how humanitarian organization works, and that we actually work with banks, and that banks have all these procedures in place to prevent making funds inadvertently available to designated terrorist actors. So we thought maybe it could also have been actually helpful to have banks explaining that there is actually already a system in place. So to make this link between legitimate counterterrorism concerns and then the banking sector. Or then another aspect that we were also thinking about, so we intervened in Parliament because the bill was in Parliament. Before we and some other humanitarian organization, we had tried to intervene with the government now, and we submitted a public position. And then you talk a bit to what I call our natural interlocutor, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but they're not the ones driving these kinds of laws. So it would have been probably better for us to engage with Treasury or Interior, but that's not an area where we necessarily have contacts, and we don't have an established relationship. While I would presume that probably the banking and the private sector would also be better placed for that aspect. So maybe if we're also trying to think about how to advocate, that yes, you can have a partnership to make sure that the banking can still happen, but if maybe we could also think about coordinating or working together when it comes to the shaping of the regulatory framework as such.
Yeah, thanks for those initial points, Sandra. I think you touched on a couple of interesting topics. Certainly, this last point around having the right contact for advocacy is an interesting one. I know a lot of us engaging regularly with government for humanitarian purposes don't actually engage with Treasury or some of the other internal departments that you mentioned there. So there is that gap in who we engage with. I wonder also if you have any comment. This last year, not just for Swiss legislation, but we also saw action in the Netherlands with the Dutch Senate on potential changes to counterterror legislation. There was Security Council resolution action earlier in the year as well. I think one of the challenges that we've run into is just the ability to track these different potential legal or UN resolutions coming through, and any efforts that you're aware of in terms of looking forward and how we better stay connected, even cross borders, when it comes to some of the potential upcoming issues that individual governments or UN might be taking on de-risking.
How to better follow? I think ICVA is now doing a good job in that. No, but I think what I generally, I think I agree with you. I think for the last couple of maybe 4 or 5 years, we have seen like a second wave of new counterterrorism laws and regulations. And I think for us, it's always easier to follow on an international level and then maybe a bit in the Western sphere. But then a lot of our operations, they take place in other countries. And there I find it very challenging to navigate their legislation and the legislative developments, because what I find, we quite often can follow discussions and you can talk to NGOs who follow this more closely, But then at some point it always stops. Then either the bill is adopted or it's a bit unclear. There are different translation of what is going on now, and then you could say, okay, we are in the country and we could follow up, but then also we are not an advocacy organization, so that's not also really our role. So also we don't want to create confusion with our host government's interlocutors by following up too closely on that. So maybe there needs to be something how we can broaden the way how we follow up beyond Western countries and look more into the countries where we actually operate.
And I guess from an advocacy perspective, where do you see the greatest challenge from the NGO or humanitarian side? Is it with the government actors in trying to improve understanding on that level, or would you say with the banking or private sector and understanding there, or a combination?
To be honest, I'm not sure about the banking sector. No, I was very interested in Mark's presentation because I'd never heard about banks being so understanding. Because we often feel that they just see that you transfer money into questionable jurisdictions, and then there's a host of questions coming with that. But maybe that's also for a lot of NGOs that what Mark says, we don't build this relationship. But I do also think there may be something about that we are a small player. And then, who would actually also be in charge within the banking sector of building this relationship. For government, I think, governments, they're not, it's not unitary, I think normally Ministry of Foreign Affairs has a lot of understanding. And then I think, as I explained before, I think a lot of these laws and policies are not driven by them. And I think we often also see a disconnect between the foreign policies of governments and then what they do internally. And the Swiss experience is a good example. Now, Switzerland is a member of a good humanitarian donorship. They've always advocated for humanitarian exemptions as part of their foreign policy. But then the government didn't want one as part of our own law. So I think there's also this disconnect that we need to learn to navigate. And then within government, once you enter into a parliamentarian process, it's no longer about the government, it's about parties and individual members. And there you can find some people who have been following or who have always been in favor of humanitarian causes, but then also you have some who simply don't know. So it's probably different challenges, but equally challenging.
Yeah, I think certainly, as I mentioned earlier, in a lot of our engagement as humanitarians with government, that issue can come up depending on who you're talking to. There can be some very different opinions, and maybe linked a little bit to the risk sharing point that we brought up in talking with Mark too. Sometimes, even when it comes to negotiating contractual obligations, for example, difficult to get all of the correct people together in the same place to really work out those issues in advance versus having things come up and deal with them later. So an interesting challenge to take on to get, well, one, to encourage more open dialogue, as I think we're trying to do here on de-risking, and then also get the right people in the room to really make change possible. I know, friends, I know we're running quickly through our time, so I want to make sure we have enough time to move on to Virginie. So I think, Sandra, we'll move on at this point. Please continue to join us as long as you can.
Yeah, sorry, I also have to leave at 4 o'clock, so I have 2 more minutes.
Okay. Well,
but I'm happy to follow Virginie for 2 minutes.
Excellent, and thank you very much again for your comments. And as with Mark as well, we'll look forward to not just collaboration this afternoon, but an ongoing interaction too as we take forward this important topic. So thank you again for your comments.
Thank you very much.
Now on to our colleague Virginie Lefebvre, who is representing AMEL Association International Lebanon. Virginie is Program Partnership Coordinator for AMEL, also coming from a legal background and working with NGOs for the past 15 years, particularly in the area of human rights, similar to some of the work that Sandra has done. I'm based since 2010 in Beirut, so closely involved with some of our NGO colleague work in the field. So I think an important field perspective to bring into the conversation as well from Virginie, and also a board member of ICVA. Good to point that out as well. So Virginie knows ICVA well. With that, Virginie, I'll turn it over to you. It'd be great to hear some more, as I said, about particular context in Lebanon, but I think also just the field perspective when it comes to some of the challenges that arise from de-risking in banking. So over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. So very happy to be with you today. So I'm definitely not an expert in bank de-risking, but I'm unfortunately becoming increasingly an expert in all the banking challenges, which are currently our reality, not only in Lebanon, but definitely the insights I'll be sharing with you are based on my practice in Lebanon. But just before going into the context, the Lebanese context, because I believe it affects a lot the challenges we're facing right now with banks, just a couple of words on the organization I'm working with, just so that you understand when I'm going to refer to some programs and so on. So I'm working for a non-sectarian Lebanese NGO created back in 1979. So since then used to navigate in the banking system in Lebanon, and working with 800 staff and volunteers and providing different types of assistance to over 20,000 individuals per month in different sectors, including health, protection, education, food security, and livelihood. So the context in Lebanon in which we are operating currently means multiple crises. I think that we're currently seeing many countries facing a similar context, but just a recap. So Lebanon is facing the Syrian crisis since 2011, 2012, with major influx of Syrian refugees, and as well a country hosting previously Palestinian refugee, Iraqi refugee, and so on. Also acute socio-economic crisis, and this is what I'm going to focus on in a couple of seconds, but since the end of 2019, acute socio-economic crisis and banking crisis, in fact. COVID-19 pandemic, I'm not going to go too much into the details. I think it's quite similar to almost every other countries. And the Beirut blast, you've all seen the images and the casualties related to this major explosion. But going back to the current context, and in particular, the socio-economic one. So the fact that we are facing all those crises means in practice fragility, conflict, and instability. And it means as well that we are implementing large-scale humanitarian and development responses, both in terms of transfer of cash, but as well in terms of receiving funds. So banks are definitely very much needed, usually in such a context. And until recently, I would say a year and a half ago, I would have told you we don't have major issues with banks. Indeed, we are navigating into the counter-terrorism legislation and so on. We have to go through the due diligence. We're facing issue with the intermediary bank and so on, but nothing we couldn't adapt our work plan with. We were used to it, so we were always, having this 3 months prep phase because we knew that the transfer could get late and so on. We were helping smaller NGOs to receive their funds. It was manageable. But the situation has unfortunately changed with the collapse of the economic systems and the banking system. And what is our issue is that when you were doing a risk analysis in Lebanon as an NGO till 1 year and a half ago, the only risk you wouldn't put, we were putting everything, natural catastrophe and so on, but we were not putting the collapse of the banking system. Why? Because Lebanon was being perceived as the so-called Switzerland of the Middle East. The banking system was stable. And since 1 year and a half, this is not the case anymore. I won't go into the economic explanation, but the practical consequences are that we cannot rely anymore on banks in Lebanon. Why? Because whenever we are receiving funds from abroad in US it's very difficult for us to access them. It's very difficult. Suppliers do not trust check anymore. The exchange rate between the lira and the US dollar was fixed till recently. Now we have 3 different black markets. So the banks are applying certain rates, which are not even driven by the central bank and so on. So all of this is translated into practice for NGOs, as we cannot rely on banks. Even if we have money in our bank accounts, we never know if we're going to be able to withdraw it. We never know if we're going to be able to make a transfer. Our staff never know if they're going to be able to cash their check or to receive their transfer. So very practically speaking, we had to find solution so that people could basically access the funds. And I want to give you 3 examples of this adaptation. I wouldn't call it innovation, because we didn't think when we imagined this that we were innovating. We just thought we have to find a solution right now so that we can have impactful and effective humanitarian action. The first one is related to cash assistance. So traditionally, there used to be ATM card for refugee and then transfer of funds for refugees and Lebanese. With the collapse of the banking system, the big UN agencies were still able to work with the model of you give an ATM card to a refugee or to a Lebanese, and then he or she goes to the bank and takes the money. The other smaller agencies, being NGOs or others, started to face difficulty with this model. So what we've been doing is that we approach financial service providers, not to mention any name, and we were able to negotiate some deals so that individuals could go there and directly take the money cash. However, this brings to us many issues, because we have to bring to the financial service provider the exact amount of money that is going to be cash by the individual, and those facilities, the financial service provider counters, are becoming quite an issue in terms of protection, because as mentioned by Sandra before, right, everybody knows that if you're going to this place at the beginning of the month, you're going there to obviously get your cash transfer, and it's not as safe as an ATM card where you would take money all over the month. So this is raising issue. However, it was a good mitigation measure, and it has been used as well following the Beirut blast response to transfer money to small businesses so that they could rehabilitate their space and use it with foreign currency. We were also able to negotiate with those financial service providers, should we be able to bring them foreign currency, that people would get foreign currency, so we would have a good value for money. However, until now, a very limited number of NGOs have been using those financial service providers to get big amounts of funds, because they don't have the liquidity to give you the funds, and you don't want to get your big grant coming from an institutional donor coming in cash. It would raise, obviously, lots of issues audit-wise. I also wanted to mention here that it was quite natural in Lebanon to use those financial service providers as well, because the diaspora has been using it a lot over the years with the country. So it was very natural for us to reach out to those service providers. That's for the financial service provider. However, and this is going to be my second point after the 2 practical examples, it is not enough. We also have to do advocacy and joint work with the bank, no matter to what extent we do not trust them. And this is what we've been doing as well, together with the NGO Forum. And that's going to be my second, I would say, good example. We set up a group, a working group, with the local NGO Forum, and the International NGO Forum did the same. And we put together in the same virtual room all the finance officers saying, how are you doing it? I'm using Western Union transfer. I was able to open a bank account abroad and to get the money this way. And there we were able to find a set of 10 solutions that we've been presenting to donors as, you know, opportunities to negotiate grant. Because at some point, because we were not able to take the money out of the bank because no one was trusting the bank, we had some difficulties as well to sign our grant agreements, right? Because as local and national NGOs, we don't have bank accounts traditionally abroad where we can get the money and just do small transfers every month. So I would say that the second best practice after the financial service provider would be this identification of common best practices among local and national NGOs, helping to de-risk a bit the bank. And my third best practice, which is not an NGO best practice, but I wish it would be extended to NGOs, is the collective humanitarian exchange rate. So a couple of UN agencies in country were able to negotiate with the central bank a collective humanitarian exchange rate. And now there are ongoing discussions so that this collective humanitarian exchange rate would be eventually applied to the implementing partners of the UN and in general to the humanitarian partner. And I believe that this is something important because it shows the power of advocacy, how you can negotiate to de-risk a bit your relationship with the bank if you have this collective negotiation. And indeed, I don't think that, I mean, no one needs to be convinced that we should be exempted from the regular rules because we're not there to make profit out of the money we're receiving. We're supposed to use this money and to transfer it directly or indirectly, directly to the affected communities, that's for sure. So based on those three solutions, what I want to highlight is that those are, for me, ad hoc mitigation measures, but we're not solving the root causes, right? We're just trying to find on the spot some solutions so that we're able to get the money. But we have to think a bit long term. And there I have a couple of suggestions. I wouldn't call it a roadmap, but I would say a call for action for all of us. And my first recommendation, which is in fact not a recommendation, just a fact, we will not get this anywhere if we're not acting collectively. This means not only acting as a group of INGOs, group of national NGOs, the donors, the UN agencies. We have to work together. This is, I think, very, very important with the private sector, because we've been hearing it today. The private sector is quite an important player in this matter. So my first recommendation would be to use the NGO fora, international, national NGO fora, to advocate for common and fair conditions with the banks, but as well with the financial service provider, because indeed, if you're a big international NGO, it might be easier to negotiate something than if you're a smaller national NGO. So using those NGO fora as a place where to negotiate with the other stakeholders in order to make sure to have similar conditions, no matter if you're a small local organizations or a bigger international NGOs. And as well, when you're coming together, then it brings credibility and you mitigate a bit the thing of, it's risky to have this deal with a smaller national NGO or a smaller local NGO because you're coming together as presenting joint and common solution. The second recommendation is very practical, but this is something I see which is really, really missing among local and national NGO, is providing support to those local and national NGOs to establish risk mitigation plan with the financial service provider, but not only with the bank. We're not used to it. We don't have the experience of, we face a similar situation 15 years ago in Africa, or I don't know where. It's the very first time we're facing this in Lebanon, and we don't know, we're learning. So we have to get the support to establish clear plans to mitigate, which will also help us when it comes to negotiation with donors and with the private partners as well. And then my third recommendation is as well to make sure that collectively we raise awareness abroad on what is our situation. Often what I see is that in country, donors, UN are very, very much aware of what's the situation in Lebanon. However, when it comes to negotiating a grant with the capital, then we have to re-explain everything. And it's not going to be for granted that the donor is going to tell you, yes, we agree that your cash program is going to work with a financial service provider. They might say no because they're not aware at all of the situation. So the importance as well of bringing those country contexts, and I know that Lebanon might not be the worst one in terms of bank risking, de-risking, but bringing those country contexts up to the attention of the capitals and of the other stakeholders of our humanitarian development system. Over.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those comments, Virginie. I think super helpful to hear not just some of the challenges, but also some of the measures you took to adapt to the situation, and the proposals for more systematic change going forward. I think it's important to understand how we not just adapt to a situation, but actually improve the system overall. And I think as you highlighted, if this is a challenge in the Lebanese context, I think certainly when we think of locations like Somalia, others, even more challenging when it comes to the lack of a common banking system, for example. So quite interesting comments. I wonder overall, in your recommendations at the end, you highlighted the collective action piece, you highlighted the support to local and national actors in particular, and risk mitigation plans, also the collective awareness. Would you have any recommendations on what specifically we might want to see from humanitarian donor governments in terms of change on their end? Would that involve contractual changes to the terms and conditions in their agreements? What would you recommend in terms of a change on the donor government side that we would advocate for?
Okay, I'm gonna have some very little recommendation because I'm now finalizing the negotiation of a grant agreement. So I have all the, and this is also what's important, to be focused and to have some practical recommendation for our donor colleague. So the first thing is to shift a bit the thinking of we're doing big installments to an NGO because it's easier, it's less of admin work and so on. When you're working in a country where the banking system is unstable, where you have potentially to do some transfer with financial service provider, it is not a good idea to transfer big amount of money. So it is better if from the very beginning, the donor would consider in certain contexts to have much more and smaller transfers of funds so that we mitigate the risk. The second thing is as well, and this is something we've been doing in Lebanon, the acceptance by the donor to have as a plan B that the transfer would be done to one of the partner organization abroad, and then this partner organization would bring you in a way or another the funds. You know that there are other options than just transferring on one bank account and it's set in stone. You sign your grant agreement at the very beginning, you cannot change it. I think we have to adapt to this and to be flexible in a way. And I would say as well that the third point would be to accept as well the delays. Even though we're working in the humanitarian system and we're under a lot of pressure to deliver, and this makes sense because we're accountable to the people that have to live with dignity, right? But we have to be flexible in terms of implementation and understand that there are delays that are due to this issue with the bank as well. And it's a call for flexibility as well. And my fourth point, which is not related to the grant agreement at all, but really related to the donor, the donors are related to government as well. And they are a big, they have a big power when it comes to pressure, right? What I'm telling you about the Lebanese bank is also governed by the central bank. And this central bank is part of the whole political system. So also have to pressure the government and the central bank and so on, so that they ease the condition on NGOs. They are there, they're supposed to be there to support us as well, to call for reforms, to call for more governance, to call for easier conditions on NGOs, and particularly we need this support as local and national NGOs.
Excellent. I think super helpful and also clear points on how we can pick up some advocacy on the donor side too. I think the point you bring up around the importance of the system, I think serving the need as opposed to just serving the system itself or its own self-perpetuation is an important one to bring up. So how can we ensure that all of us engaged in supporting humanitarian work understand how we set up the system to better serve its purpose, which should be the needs of the people that we exist to serve. So I think as we think forward to future advocacy, important that we make that clear among not just our NGO colleagues, but our colleagues in the private sector, banking, government as well. And interesting you bring up the political effort link too. I think certainly on the ICVA side, will be interesting to think how we engage on that area, whether it's with GHD, other donor groups, to make that political element more clear and see if what opportunity there might exist to increase the pressure there too. Friends, with that, I knew this hour would go very quickly, and we've already gone through the hour. So Virginie, I want to thank you for your excellent comments. Very interesting to hear from the country perspective, some of the challenges and also the solutions, I think, emerging. As with our other speakers, Mark and Sandra, I think hopefully this is not the end of a conversation, but another step in how we carry forward with this challenge of improving some of the conditions around bank de-risking, particularly for our colleagues in the field, and understanding how we can, as we've been discussing, ensure that the system is set up to better serve the needs of the people that we exist as humanitarians to serve. So thank you. A sincere thanks to our speakers. Yes, as Andrew says, another step. So hopefully we'll keep taking advantage of the opportunity to move forward in this work. And I think good that we've had this opportunity to engage more closely in a broader discussion with both the banking sector, NGO colleagues. I think I didn't get to make my opening comments at the beginning, but I think very good that we have this opportunity to move forward and hopefully facilitate some more open dialogue on some of these challenges, which again, I think has been a common thread throughout some of our work on risk management. How can we have more open dialogue on these issues that affect actually a broad range of stakeholders in the humanitarian space, not just individuals. So good that we continue that effort, see how we can improve our collaborative advocacy work in this area of bank de-risking. I think Nishani posted in the chat, if you're interested in seeing in following the risk series and also the webinar that we did previously on bank de-risking through PHAP with ICVA, there's a link to that in the chat for those interested to follow up on that topic more. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you, Virginie, and thanks to all of our attendees who were part of the discussion today.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks. I think it just ends, huh?
Yeah, I think we just leave this. Yeah, cool. Okay.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.